In this demo, I'm going to show you how to use the element name to specify a source object for a binding. Our scenario for this one is we still want to delete customers like in the last demo, but instead we decide we want to put the delete button outside the data grid and not have it repeated in every row. We're also going to use commands here again as the way we're going to invoke our functionality. So the first thing we're going to want to do is define a new dependency property that's a command we can target from this separate button we're going to add. So I'm going to add a delete selected command that's also a relay command of customer, and we're going to end up targeting that same onDelete customer as the execute method for that command. We're going to need to initialize that, so we'll add a initializer up here in the constructor to set that property to an instance of a relay command. But this one's going to pass an extra method here to the constructor of the relay command. Relay command supports the concept of executing a target method. It also supports having a canExecute handler as a target method. And the canExecute will be called first to determine whether the command should actually execute the target method. So we need to add that method to our class as well. That method takes this kind of signature. It takes in the same parameter as the execute method does, a customer, and it returns a Boolean. The Boolean, if it's true, says that the command is enabled. You can go ahead and invoke the execute method. If it returns false, then it should not only not invoke the execute method, if it's hooked up to something like a button, that button will be disabled. And you can see the logic here is we're just going to check our data grid and see if there's actually a selected item and return true or false based on that. Now the other thing we need to do is make sure we signal the button to requery this canExecute method whenever the state that drives it changes. So whenever the selected item changes, we want it to requery this. The way you do that with the relay command is you call raise canExecute changed on it whenever the affected state is modified. So we have our selection change handler for our data grid. We can just call that anytime selection changes, and that's going to cause this to be called by the button to requery the state and get a new true or false value. Now with all that command nonsense out of the way, what does the binding look like? Let's jump over to our main window, and we've got a stack panel sitting here atop our data grid. I'm going to go ahead and add a button that simply says content equal delete on it. So it's just going to sit right on top of our data grid and be a delete button. Now we need to hook this up to our command. Well, hooking it up to the command is actually easier here than it was down inside the data grid because the overall data context is flowing down to this from up above. And that data context is the window itself. So we just need to get to the exposed property on the window that is the command. So we can use a straightforward binding that goes to the delete selected command. Now we also need to pass a command parameter. So I'm also going to use the command parameter property and set that equal to a binding. But this binding needs to point to the customer that needs to be deleted. And how do we know where that is? Well, it happens to be the selected item on the data grid. So we basically need to turn the data grid into our source object. And you can do that through an element name binding. So I'm just going to say element name equals customer's data grid, which you can see down below is the X name of the data grid. That makes that the source object for this binding. And then I just need the path to point to the selected item property of that source object. With that in place, we're ready to go. I can go ahead and run. We can see our button up at the top is disabled because of the canExecute checks and there is no selected item currently. As soon as I select an item, the event handler fires, it raises canExecute changed, and the command calls that canExecute handler again and sees that it can enable. Now that the button is enabled, I click it and that first row goes away. Select another one, click it, and the row goes away. So our functionality is all hooked up through an element name binding, which just points to some element by name that is in the overall XAML you're working with, and then uses the path to refine what properties on that object you want to grab values from.